Chapter 2 of Letters on an Elk Hunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Carroll. Letters on an Elk Hunt by Elinore Pruitt Stewart. Chapter 2. The Start. In Camp on the Desert, August 24th, 1914. Dear Mrs. Coney, at last we are off. I am powerfully glad. I shall have to enjoy this trip for us both. You see how greedy I am for new experiences. I have never been on a prolonged hunt before, so I am looking forward to a heap of fun. I hardly know what to do about writing, but shall try to write every 2 days. I want you to have as much of this trip as I can put on paper. So we will begin at the start. To begin with, we were all to meet at Green River to start the 20th. But a professor coming from somewhere in the East delayed us a day, and also some of the party changed their plans. That reduced our number but not our enthusiasm. A few days before we left the ranch, I telephoned Mrs. Louderer and tried to persuade her to go along, but she replied, "For why should I go? What? Is it to freeze? I can sleep out on some rocks here, and with a stick I can beat the sage bush, which will give me the smell you will smell of the outside. And for the game I can have a beef kill, which is better to eat as elk." I love Mrs. Louderer dearly, but she is absolutely devoid of imagination, and her matter-of-factness is mighty trying sometimes. However, she sent me a bottle of goose grease to ward off colds from the kinder. I tried Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, but she was plumb aggravating and non-committal, and it seemed when we got to Green River that I would be the only woman in the party. Besides, all the others were strangers to me, except young Mr. Haynes, who was organizing the hunt. Really, the prospect didn't seem so joyous. The afternoon before we were to start, I went with Mr. Stewart and Mr. Haynes to meet the train. We were expecting the professor, but the only passenger who got off was a slight, gray-eyed girl. She looked about her uncertainly for a moment and then went into the depot while we returned to the hotel. Just as I started up the steps, my eyes were gladdened by the sight of Mrs. O'Shaughnessy in her buckboard trotting merrily up the street. She waved her hand to us and drove up. Clyde took her team to the livery barn, and she came up to my room with me. "It's going with you I am," she began. "Ye'll need somebody to keep yez straight and to sew up the holes ye'll be shootin' into each other." After she had tidied up a bit, we went down to supper. We were all seated at one table, and there was yet an empty place. But soon the girl we had seen get off the train came and seated herself in it. "Can any of you tell me how to get to Kendall, Wyoming?" she asked. I didn't know, nor did Clyde, but Mrs. O'Shaughnessy knew, so she answered, "Kendall is in the forest reserve up north. It is 200 miles from here, and half of the distance is across desert. But they have an automobile route as far as Pinedale. You could get that far on the auto stage. After that, I suppose you could get some one to take you on." "Thank you," said the girl. "My name is Elizabeth Hull. I am alone in the world, and I am not expected at Kendall, so I am obliged to ask and to take care of myself." Mrs. O'Shaughnessy at once mentioned her own name and introduced the rest of us. After supper, Miss Hull and Mrs. O'Shaughnessy had a long talk. I was not much surprised when Mrs. O'Shaughnessy came in to tell me that she was going to take the girl along. "Because," she said, "Kendall is on our way, and it's glad I am to help a lone girl. Did you notice the freckles of her? Sure her forebears hailed from Killarney." So early next morning we were astir. We had outfitted in Green River, so the wagons were already loaded. I had rather dreaded the professor. I had pictured to myself a very dignified, bespectacled person, and I mentally stood in awe of his great learning. Imagine my surprise when a boyish, laughing young man introduced himself as Professor Glenholdt. He was so jolly, so unaffected, and so altogether likable that my fear vanished and I enjoyed the prospect of his company. Mr. Haynes and his friend Mr. Struble on their wagon led the way. Then we followed, and after us came Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, and Miss Hull brought up the rear, with the professor riding horseback beside first one wagon and then another. So we set out. There was a great jangling and banging, for our tin camp stoves kept the noise going. Neither the children nor I can ride under cover on a wagon. We get so sick. So there we were, perched high up on great rolls of bedding and a tent. I reckon we looked funny to the onlookers looking on, as we clattered down the street. But we were off, and that meant a heap. All the morning our way lay up the beautiful river, past the great red cliffs and through tiny green parks. But just before noon the road wound itself up onto the mesa, which is really the beginning of the desert. We crowded into the shadow of the wagons to eat our midday meal, but we could not stop long because it was 28 miles to where we could get water for the horses when we should camp that night, so we wasted no time. Shortly after noon we could see white clouds of alkali dust ahead. By and by we came up with the dust raisers. The children and I had got into the buckboard with Mrs. O'Shaughnessy and Miss Hull, so as to ride easier and be able to gossip, and we had driven ahead of the wagons so as to avoid the stinging dust. The sun was just scorching when we overtook the funniest layout I have seen since Cora Belle drove up to our door the first time. Footnote: the story of Cora Belle is told in Letters of a Woman Homesteader. In a wobbly old buckboard sat a young couple completely engrossed by each other. That he was a Westerner we knew by his cowboy hat and boots. That she was an Easterner by her not knowing how to dress for the ride across the desert. She wore a foolish little chiffon hat which the alkali dust had ruined, and all the rest of her clothes matched. But over them the enterprising young man had raised one of those big old sunshades that had lettering on them. It kept wobbling about in the socket he had improvised. One minute we could see tea, then a rut in the road would swing coffee around. Their sunshade kept revolving about that way, and sometimes their heads revolved a little bit too. We could hear a word occasionally and knew they were having a great deal of fun at our expense, but we were amused ourselves, so we didn't care. They would drive along slowly until we almost reached them. Then they would whip up and raise such a dust that we were almost choked. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy determined to drive ahead, so she trotted up alongside, but she could not get ahead. The young people were giggling. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy doesn't like to be the joke all the time. Suddenly she leaned over toward them and said, "Will ye tell me something?" Oh, yes, they would. "Then," she said, "which of you are tea and which coffee?" Their answer was to drive up faster and stir up a powerful lot of dust. They kept pretty well ahead after that, but at sundown we came up with them at the well where we were to camp. This well had been sunk by the county for the convenience of travelers, and we were mighty thankful to find it. It came out that our young couple were bride and groom. They had never seen each other until the night before, having met through a matrimonial paper. They had met in Green River and were married that morning, and the young husband was taking her away up to Pinedale to his ranch. They must have been ideally happy, for they had forgotten their mess box and had only a light lunch. They had only their lap robe for bedding. They were in a predicament, but the girl's chief concern was lest Honeybug should let the wolves get her. Though it is scorching hot on the desert by day, the nights are keenly cool, and I was wondering how they would manage with only their lap robe, when Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, who cannot hold malice, made a round of the camp, getting a blanket here and a coat there until she had enough to make them comfortable. Then she invited them to take their meals with us until they could get to where they could help themselves. I think we all enjoyed camp that night, for we were all tired. We were in a shallow little cañon, not a tree, not even a bush except sagebrush. Luckily there was plenty of that, so we had roaring fires. We sat around the fire talking as the blue shadows faded into gray dusk and the big stars came out. The newlyweds were, as the bride put it, so full of happiness they had nothing to put it in. Certainly their spirits overflowed. They were eager to talk of themselves, and we didn't mind listening. They are Mr. and Mrs. Tom Burney. She is the oldest of a large family of children and has had to work out ever since she was big enough to get a job. The people she had worked for rather frowned upon any matrimonial ventures, and as no provision was made for help entertaining company, she had never had a beau. One day she got hold of a matrimonial paper and saw Mr. Burney's ad. She answered, and they corresponded for several months. We were just in time to "catch it," as Mr. Haynes, who is a confirmed bachelor, disgustedly remarked. Personally, I am glad. I liked them much better than I thought I should when they were raising so much dust so unnecessarily. I must close this letter, as I see the men are about ready to start. The children are standing the trip well, except that Robert is a little sun blistered. Did I tell you we left Junior with his grandmother? Even though I have the other three, my heart is hungry for my big boy, who is only a baby, too. He is such a precious little man. I wish you could see him. With a heart very full of love for you, E. R. S. End of chapter 2.